on the human body. Now, not everyone tested positive back then on the human body. Now, not everyone tested positive back then on the human body. Now, not everyone tested positive back then on the human body. Now, not everyone tested positive back then on the human body. Now, not everyone tested positive. What kind of powerful tool is that if you're trying to control the human population? Your free thoughts, your free will. What kind of powerful tool is that? Never be as what we perceived it to be when we were younger. I would rather I always say this, I'd rather die on my 2 feet as a free person than die on my knees as a slave. I would rather think about I always say this, I'd rather die on my 2 feet as a free person than die on my knees as a slave. I would rather think about I always say this, I'd rather die on my 2 feet as a free person than die on my knees as a slave. I would think about
unless I stuck by you. You're the sunflower. I think your love would be too much, or you'd be left in the dust. Unless I stuck by.
Because think about this. The human species is facing slavery like we've never seen it before on the globe, on the planet. It doesn't matter what color you are. Doesn't matter what religion you are. We all breathe and bleed the same.
decades. Jesse has worked with civilian populations, military personnel, and government agencies using advanced technical surveillance equipment to document patterns that challenge the official narratives, including why some people experience debilitating neurological symptoms, whilst others are asymptomatic at the moment. So in this conversation, we're going to dive deep into emerging links between Havana syndrome, frequency exposure, nanotechnology, and biological susceptibility, what we all need to be aware of, what symptoms to watch for, and most importantly, what protective steps we might be able to take. So a big welcome, Jesse. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm doing wonderful, and thank you for the opportunity to be on your platform.
I think everyone's asking about this, and it's something that is a lot of us have wanted to bury our heads in the sand about, but we really can't do that anymore. Before we dive into the detail, can you just give us a little bit for the listeners as to why this is a must-listen conversation for people?
Yeah, well, in 2016, the United States government's diplomats in Havana, Cuba, were complaining of an interesting phenomenon that they were being afflicted by. They were all complaining about it. And they would describe it as unusual sounds that were being transmitted to their heads, followed by short-term, long-term memory loss, severe head pain, nausea, vomiting, vertigo, and most interesting, electrical shocks through the torso and extremities, which is called buffeting today. And the United States government didn't give it any credence. They claimed it was mass hysteria. They even blamed it on crickets, cicadas at one point. And they didn't take it seriously until the Canadian diplomats started having the same symptoms. And the Canadian government supported them in offering them services as on-the-job injuries. Now, the United States government then shortly followed in supporting the diplomats. Now, on May 8th of 2024, a gentleman by the name of retired Lieutenant Colonel Greg Edgren gave testimony in front of the Department of Homeland Security at a congressional hearing, saying that not only is this happening to our diplomats, it's happening to the best of our best in the CIA, FBI, and it is currently happening to congressional members. Now, they claim that this has only been a phenomenon that started in 2016. But myself and a gentleman by the name of Dr. John Hall out of San Antonio, Texas, who at the time in 2010 when I met him was the author of a book called Satellite Terrorism in America, in which he writes about how this happened to someone very close to him. It was his fiance. This also happened to someone very close to me. This happened to my son's mother. And so when I met Dr. Hall, and we were having this discussion, he said that he believed if indeed this was something other than a mental health issue, this was actually a signal being transmitted to someone, there should be a way to detect it. And what he was doing is he was utilizing a general frequency detector, which was called the JM20 Pro. And it was used by very famous private investigators, Melinda Kidder being one of the names who was involved in the Iran-Contra investigations. She would utilize these types of devices. And so he was testing people on a very small scale, and they were coming up positive at very specific focal areas around the human body. And so I asked him, I said, well, isn't this enough to go to a general practitioner and at least help them get diagnostics? And he said, no. What is happening, as soon as they talk about the auditory symptoms, they were being railroaded into the mental health industry and being further victimized by forced institutionalization or forced medication. Okay. And it wasn't helping them. And so I said, well, my background is I'm a retired firefighter paramedic. Most of my younger life, I've been in medicine from the age of 16. I was already a darkroom tech in radiology. I was a telemetry, later became a cardiac telemetry tech. And then I graduated into being a firefighter paramedic here in the United States. And so I had a familiarization in gathering data, looking at subjectivity and objectivity. And so I wanted to do somehow see if there were enough cases out there to where we can start to take the subjective complaints and turn it into objective measurements. And so I called a meeting in Sacramento, California, early in 2009, 2010. And I asked, I sent out flyers to the community, if you're having these symptoms, please come, I want to talk to you. I expected a handful of people. And 100 people showed up. It was standing room only. And every single person there had the exact same complaints with very small deviations. And so I said, wow, this is much bigger than I ever anticipated. So we just started to do mass RF testing in the field, followed with information gathering in the form of surveys so we can gather the data. And the first meeting we had in Davis, California, had over 300 people showed up.
Wow.
And it was very daunting. And so I said, wow, that's exactly my words. But the data started to paint an interesting picture. Back then, in 2010, those who were most likely to be afflicted by this phenomenon were recently single, widowed, or divorced Caucasian women who were highly educated, followed by Caucasian males, and same subsets, African Americans, Asians, and then Hispanics, and it dwindled down from there. That stayed consistent into the Midwest of the United States until we hit Chicago, where the African American criteria and Caucasian criteria flipped. And that's because of the demographics, is what my suspicion was. And that stayed consistent all the way to the East Coast with one anomaly, which was up in the Virginia area, the Northeast of the United States, in which a group of military subcontractors who heard that I was doing this type of testing, and they asked me to come and test them all. Eventually, that took me to Europe, where a government agency asked me to come and test their diplomats. Also bring anyone who I felt that was being afflicted by this or was sure there was a victim of this, to bring them. And they allowed me to use a testing facility at a research university. I had to sign an NDA, but it was called an anechoic chamber, which was rated to block out frequencies between 8 gigahertz and 19 gigahertz, which was well within the spectrum of frequencies that we were detecting in the victims out in the field. And we had a hypothesis, just as in the diplomats and the federal employees. They said they could not escape this frequency. It would follow them. The same thing was happening to the civilians. And so we had a hypothesis. There's something unique about them internally that this frequency is following them. And when we got to Europe and we used control groups of people who were non-symptomatic back then and put them in the anechoic chamber, and our frequency counters would read 0. And it was the first time ever they would read 0, because they're constantly scanning. As soon as you turn them on, they scan. And when we brought in the symptomatic victims, we would get frequencies in the anechoic chamber. So it was at that point we said, for whatever reason, we didn't know what it was at that time, that they are emitting a frequency. And I'm going to share.
It must have been terrifying for them. I mean, to be told that must be pretty terrifying.
Yeah. Well, they were elated in a crazy way, because it was for the first time that they felt validated. They knew they weren't crazy, but this was the first time that we can say, you're not crazy. There's definitely something going on. And ultimately, what we found out, and this is a famous case that I can talk about, this is the Bonnie Kellerby case. Okay, Bonnie was one of my earliest clients who we did RF testing on. And remember me talking about that first meeting in Sacramento, California.
Yeah.
She was there along with her husband. And the story behind Bonnie is Dr. John Hall called me one evening. He says, Jesse, can you please call this couple? Her husband is about to divorce her because he thinks she's crazy. Okay. And I always pose this question to everyone. How many people have someone in their family, a friend, or know someone who is suffering from mental illness?
Yeah.
I pose this serious question. What if it was synthetically induced? And this is what Mr. Kellerby, he's a very proud man. And he stood up in that meeting in Sacramento and he sobbed. And he said, I was about to lose the love of my life because I thought she was crazy. And he says, and after hearing each and every one of you who have the exact same symptoms as her, I can no longer say that. I need to support her. And what ultimately happened, he took her to every doctor's appointment. He saw every specialist that he could find. And what ultimately happened, biosensors that were not consensually implanted in her. And these are the images of these biosensors that were removed from Bonnie. And Bonnie and John are now very dear friends of mine, and I consider them family. But this is what they look like. They don't get rejected by our bodies. They have nanowires that extend from them. They come in various shapes and sizes. And these are photographic images of them. And next, I'm going to show you the report that once they were removed, they did chain of custody and they took them to a lab and they were analyzed. But this is why I say, what if the mental illness was synthetically induced, and how would you feel? And this is just the photographic images. This is the evaluation in the lab. 3 specimens that were received. They followed chain of custody. And I'll go to the conclusion to speed this up. Back one. And basically in the conclusion, they found advanced material composites of specimens that illustrate various aspects of nanotechnology utilized in developing various sensory polymeric lattices, messenger,s and other building materials as associated with nanotech. The bottom line is these were implants that were put in Bonnie, and these symptoms were associated with what she was going through. And this is why the signal follows people.
Yeah.
And they can't get away from it. We've taken people down into deep granite caverns 2 miles down and still were able to detect frequencies. And these were in areas where there were no radio signals, no cell phone signals or anything. And there's a history. If we go back into the 1940s here in the United States, the U.S. government was implanting our soldiers with a large grain of rice type implant. And into the 80s, they became a small grain of rice. The later 80s, they literally became down to the size of a letter on a penny. And this was pre-COVID, pre-injection. Now, we, on average, those who were symptomatic would light up in areas between 4 and 10 areas at very specific locations on the human body. Now, not everyone tested positive back then.
Yeah.
We would get a lot of people who did not test anything. But the areas are the right and left TMJ, the nasal dorsum, the frontal lobe, the occipital lobes. The apex areas bilaterally, the scapula is bilaterally, the lower lumbar bilaterally, the hips and the quads, and occasionally down into the lower calf areas. The United States has been notorious for experimenting on its own.
Yeah.
And more specifically, what I'm going to show everyone is back in the early 70s, there was a report that was done. It's called The Individual Rights and the Federal Role in Behavior Modification. This was put out by our U.S. Congress, was the 93rd Congress. And in this report, strangely enough, it talks about in 1972, where they were experimenting on our prisoners to induce behavior modification. And back then, in 1972, they were able to remotely in real time receive biometrics from the prisoners, their respirations, their heart rate, their temperature, their blood pressures, including remotely reading thoughts. And this is exactly what we discovered in this report. Now, let's go further into the future. In November of 1994, this report was obtained through a FOIA request. It's called the New World Vistas. And this was an agenda for the United States Air Force to remain a superpower 50 years into the future. Now, strangely enough, and this was done by the greatest minds in the U.S. Air Force. And so we know, although this was released in 1994, that this technology that they've been working on developing and strategizing over the years was developed far before that.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, on page 89 in this report is called a chapter called Biological Processes. And in this, they talk about using RF technology in order to remotely affect the human bodies, its biological processes, how they can incapacitate someone. They can transmit voices to their heads. Now, here's what's even crazier, including imprinting memory sets into one human from another and erasing memory sets. Okay. So this was in 1994. Now, where are we today? Recently, I normally see people who are symptomatic, and I only do the technology side. I don't practice medicine. I'm not a licensed doctor or a licensed medical practitioner anyway. We only address the technological side, the RF and the frequency aspect of this phenomenon. We'll coach people on what to do if they think this is something that's happening like the Bonnie Keller bees have, and other cases that we've been successful in at least proving this prior to the jab. So where are we today? There is a clip that I sent you on Dr. Ido Bachelet. If you could play that real quick.
That's the first one.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, he did this in 2013. It's a TED-Med talk he did in Israel. And listen to what he says about the syringe that he just brought from his lab.
All right, just.
And I'll show you this syringe, which I brought from my lab. So this syringe has inside it 1,000 billion robots. So these robots are each 50 nanometers long, which as you can see in this slide under the microscope. 50 nanometers is about 2,000 times thinner than the thickness of your hair.
Okay.
Oh my goodness.
So, yes. And what I'm about to share with everyone is the rest of that. What he does go, and he teaches his students. You know, he was talking about just bringing that from his lab. Now, in his defense, I will say this. Technology in of itself is not good or bad, okay? And I truly believe in Dr. Ido Bachelet's heart. He's only looking at the goodness in this technology, okay? So I want everyone out there to be very clear about that. I know he was doing this for good reasons, you know, and partially because something had happened to his daughter and he thought that this could help her, okay? But it's what happens to the people who gain access to this technology and want to use it in other ways. Now, these nano robots, that's exactly what they are controlled by RF emissions. They can carry a payload. They can open up. They'll do whatever they are programmed to do. These are basically miniature computers. They'll self-assemble. They'll self-replicate. They'll attach to the DNA. They can cross the blood-brain barrier. Okay. And so this is all computer logic that he teaches his students how to control with an Xbox controller when they're in a host. Okay. Yeah. And so where are we? We now know there are studies out there that show that the xylocaine derivative has these strange crystalline structures that are square. And strangely enough, they look just like Dr. Ido Bachelet's nanorobots. And that's what they're finding when they analyze the anesthetic. They also know that this has been found in...
Sorry, I just want to stop you there just so that people know. So they found this in all anesthetics they've tested, or?
Right now, what we're finding, there is not any xylocaine derivative or lidocaine derivative. They don't find this in now.
Right.
Okay. So also, there are studies now that we now know that in the Pfizer and Moderna, that this exact, the same nanotechnology was found in them.
Yeah.
There is Dr. Sherry Tenpenny just